What happens when psychologists decide to play God? When they test morality, memory, obedience, not in theory, but on real people. The answers changed everything, and they came at a terrible cost. In 1971, perfectly normal college students were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards in a fake prison. Within days, the guards became sadistic. The prisoners broke down. The experiment had to be stopped early. It had become too real, too dangerous, too revealing about what we're capable of becoming. Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Mind Lab. I'm glad you found your way here. Maybe it's late, and your mind's still wandering. Tonight, we're exploring 50 psychology experiments that changed how we understand ourselves and what we're capable of. The studies so revealing, so disturbing, that they could never be done again. Some you've heard of, whispered about in classrooms and films. Others were buried, too unsettling to speak of. But all of them worked. They showed us how easily obedience becomes cruelty, how fragile our morals are, and how thin the line is between order and madness. We learned that ordinary people will torture strangers if an authority figure tells them to. We discovered that babies need touch more than food, and proved it by watching infant primates go mad in isolation. We found that memory is fiction, that conformity is our default state, that our moral convictions collapse under the slightest pressure. We gained knowledge we desperately needed, and we paid for it with suffering we can never undo. Before we begin, I'm curious, what time is it where you are tonight? And have you ever heard of an experiment that still haunts you? Leave a comment, I read them all. If these quiet explorations help you think or rest, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this little lab of curiosity keep growing. Now, take a breath, and let's begin our descent into the human mind. The year is 1961. You volunteered for what you think is a memory study at Yale University. You're sitting at a control panel. In front of you, a row of switches labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450. The final switches are marked simply XX. In the next room, strapped to a chair, is another volunteer. You can't see him, but you can hear him. Your job is simple: read him word pairs. When he gets one wrong, you shock him, and with each mistake, you increase the voltage. At first, it's fine. A little buzz, 15 volts, 30 volts, harmless. But then it keeps going. At 75 volts, you hear a grunt through the wall. At 120, he shouts that it's painful. At 150, he demands to be let out. The man in the white coat beside you, the scientist, says calmly, "Please continue." At 180 volts, the learner screams that he can't stand the pain. At 300, he pounds on the wall. At 330, there's just silence. "Please continue," the scientist says. The experiment requires that you go on. And here's what Stanley Milgram discovered: 65% of people went all the way to 450 volts, past the screams, past the silence, to XX. They didn't want to. Their hands shook. They sweated. They protested weakly. Shouldn't we check on him? I don't think I should continue. This doesn't seem right. But when a calm authority figure in a grey lab coat said, "Please continue," they continued. Of course, there was no real shock. The learner was an actor named James McDonough, and he was perfectly fine, following a script of predetermined responses. But the participants didn't know that. They believed they were hurting someone, maybe even killing them, and most of them kept going anyway. Milgram ran variations of this experiment, testing what factors increased or decreased obedience. When the learner was in the same room, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped to 30%. Still disturbingly high, but lower. When the authority figure left the room and gave instructions by phone, obedience plummeted to 21%. When two other teachers, who were actually actors, refused to continue, only 10% of real participants went to the maximum voltage. What this told us: proximity matters. Authorities' physical presence matters. But most importantly, social support for disobedience matters. We are far more likely to resist when we see others resisting. But here's what haunted Milgram for the rest of his life. The participants suffered, not the actors. The real people, the ones who thought they were inflicting pain. They didn't sleep well afterward. Some had nightmares. Years later, when researchers tracked them down for follow-up studies, many said the experiment had changed them, made them question themselves in ways they never had before. Some were grateful for the insight. Others wished they'd never learned what they were capable of. One participant, a pastor, said it destroyed his faith in humanity and in himself. He'd gone all the way to 450 volts, and he couldn't reconcile that with who he thought he was, with the moral teachings he preached every Sunday. Milgram believed the knowledge was worth it. That understanding our capacity for obedience was essential, especially so soon after the Holocaust, when "I was just following orders" was still echoing in courtrooms. We needed to know that ordinary people could do terrible things, not because they were evil, but because they were obedient. But he also knew he'd crossed a line. In his papers, found after his death, he wrote about his own nightmares, about watching people suffer moral anguish in his laboratory, about whether the ends justified the means. We'll never know for certain, because we can never run this experiment again. But Milgram's wasn't the only study of obedience that left scars. In 1967, a high school history teacher in Palo Alto, California, tried to answer a question his students kept asking: how could ordinary Germans participate in the Holocaust? How could normal people become Nazis? Ron Jones decided to show them instead of telling them. On Monday, he introduced a new classroom regime. Strength through discipline, he called it. Students had to sit in a specific way, feet flat on the floor, hands clasped behind their back, straight posture. They had to stand beside their desks to answer questions. Answers had to be short, 3 words or less, preceded by "Mr. Jones." The students loved it. The structure felt good. The discipline felt powerful. On Tuesday, Jones added strength through community. He created a salute, a cupped hand raised to the shoulder, like a wave breaking. Students practiced it. They started using it in the hallways, recognizing each other as members of this new movement. Jones called it the third wave. By Wednesday, membership cards were printed. Some cards had a red X. Those students were supposed to report members who didn't follow the rules. Students began reporting their friends, their parents, people who made fun of the third wave in other classes. Thursday brought strength through action. The movement was growing beyond the classroom. Students were recruiting members from other classes. Over 200 students had joined. They were enforcing the rules themselves, confronting non-members, creating an in-group and an out-group with startling speed. Jones was losing control. This was supposed to be a demonstration, but it had become real. Students were bullying non-members. The salute was everywhere. The rigid posture, the clipped answers, the reporting of dissent, it had all become normal in less than a week. On Friday, Jones ended it. He announced there would be a rally, that a national leader of the third wave movement would appear on TV to announce the formation of a new political party. 200 students packed into the auditorium. They waited. The TV was turned on. It showed footage of Nazi rallies, Hitler, swastikas, the Nuremberg trials. Jones told them the truth. There was no third wave movement. There was no national leader. "You've been used," he said. "You thought you were special, better than those outside this room. You traded your freedom for the comfort of discipline and superiority. You accepted the groups will over your own convictions. You would have made good Nazis." Students cried. Some were angry. Some were ashamed. Many felt betrayed, not just by Jones, but by themselves. They'd felt the seduction of belonging to something bigger, something powerful. They'd felt the pleasure of enforcing rules, of having clear boundaries between us and them. And they'd liked it. The experiment lasted 5 days. That's all it took to create a fascist movement in a California high school. 5 days to get students reporting their own parents, bullying their classmates, surrendering their autonomy for the comfort of rigid structure and group identity. Jones never ran the experiment again. He wrote about it, spoke about it, wrestled with it for the rest of his life. Some students thanked him years later, said it was the most important lesson they ever learned. Others never forgave him. A few said they'd never trusted groups again, never felt safe in any movement or organization, always watching for the signs of the third wave emerging. Was it worth it? Did those students need to experience the seduction of fascism to understand it? Or could Jones have just told them, warned them, trusted them to imagine it rather than live it? We don't know. But we know this: the experiment can't be repeated. Not officially, not with institutional approval, not with the safeguards and ethics reviews that govern modern research. And maybe that's for the best, because some knowledge comes at too high a price. These weren't the only studies of obedience, of course. In 1966, a psychiatrist named Charles Hoefling wondered if Milgram's findings would hold in real-world settings with actual authority figures and genuine consequences. So he targeted hospitals. Nurses received phone calls from a Dr. Smith they'd never met, instructing them to administer 20 milligrams of a drug called Astraton to a specific patient. The label on the medicine clearly stated the maximum safe dose was 10 milligrams. The hospital's own rules required written orders from doctors nurses had actually met. And Astraton wasn't even a real drug, just a sugar pill with a fake label. But Dr. Smith sounded confident, authoritative, like he knew what he was doing. 21 out of 22 nurses prepared to administer the dangerous dose before researchers stopped them. They were about to violate hospital policy, exceed the safe dosage, and give medication ordered by a stranger on the phone, all because someone with "Doctor" in front of his name told them to. When asked afterward why they complied, most said the same thing Milgram's participants said: "I was just following orders. It's not my place to question a doctor. Authority bypasses judgment. It short-circuits our moral reasoning. We defer to expertise, to credentials, to anyone who seems like they're supposed to be in charge." And then there's Muzafer Sherif's work in the 1930s, studying how we defer to group consensus, even about basic perception. He'd put people in a dark room with a single point of light. The light was actually stationary, but in complete darkness, it appears to move, a phenomenon called the autokinetic effect. Sherif would ask people to estimate how far the light moved. Alone, their estimates varied wildly. But when placed in groups, their estimates converged. Not because anyone was right. There was no right answer. The light didn't actually move. But because we seek consensus. We look to others to tell us what's real. And once a group norm was established, it persisted. New people added to the group would adopt the existing consensus, even when the original members were removed. The arbitrary became truth through repetition and social reinforcement. This is how we defer to authority, not just through obedience to direct commands, but through the gradual acceptance of group reality. We look around, see what others are doing, and assume it must be correct. We abandon our own judgment in favor of collective agreement. It's efficient most of the time. We can't personally verify everything, so we trust expertise and consensus. But sometimes that efficiency becomes dangerous. Because when authority is wrong, or when the group consensus supports harm, our instinct to defer becomes our greatest vulnerability. The question these experiments force us to ask is, would you be in the 35% who refused? Would you be the one who stood up, who questioned, who said no even when everyone else said yes. It's easy to believe you would. We all want to believe we'd be the exception. But 65% went all the way to 450 volts. And they all thought they'd be the exception too. The Stanford Prison Experiment. It's Sunday, August 14th, 1971. 9 young men are walking through the hallways beneath Stanford University's psychology building. They've been randomly assigned to be prisoners in a simulated jail. Another 9 have been assigned to be guards. They're all college students, psychologically healthy, no criminal records, middle-class backgrounds, screened carefully to ensure they were stable, normal, ordinary. The basement has been transformed, prison bars, small cells, a closet designated as solitary confinement, the hole. The guards wear uniforms and mirrored sunglasses so the prisoners can't see their eyes. They carry wooden batons. The prisoners wear smocks with ID numbers, no underwear, a chain on one ankle. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist running the study, wants to understand how institutional roles shape behavior. Are prison guards cruel because cruel people become guards? Or does the role itself create cruelty? Do prisoners become passive because they're inherently submissive? Or does the situation strip away their agency? He expects the answer will emerge over 2 weeks. It takes less than 2 days. On the first day, everyone's just playing along. The guards are awkward with authority. The prisoners are joking, testing boundaries. It feels like a game. On the second day, the prisoners rebel. They barricade themselves in their cells, rip off their ID numbers, mock the guards. It's still feeling like college kids playing dress up, but then the guards respond, and something shifts. They spray fire extinguishers into the cells. They strip the prisoners naked. They take away their mattresses, their bedding. They make them do push-ups, jumping jacks, hours of calisthenics. They put the ringleaders in the hole, a dark closet barely big enough to stand in. And they discover they like having power. By day 3, the guards have divided into types. Some are tough but fair, following the rules Zimbardo set. Others are passive, uncomfortable with the whole thing, just going through the motions. But one guard, later nicknamed John Wayne, for his swagger and cruelty, seems to relish his role. He invents new humiliations, makes prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands, forces them to simulate sexual acts, wakes them in the night for arbitrary counts that last hours. The prisoners, meanwhile, are breaking down. Prisoner 806012, Douglas Corpy, lasts 36 hours. He starts screaming that he wants out, that he can't take it anymore. Zimbardo and his team think he's faking, trying to get released early. But his distress is real. He's crying, shaking, seems to be losing touch with reality. Zimbardo finally lets him out. One down. The others start showing signs of extreme stress. Some develop psychosomatic rashes. Others become passive, obedient, referring to themselves by their prisoner numbers instead of their names. One prisoner, previously known as a vibrant, funny guy, becomes withdrawn and quiet. When asked how he's doing, he just stares and doesn't respond. The guards, meanwhile, are escalating. They're no longer just following instructions or maintaining order. They're inventing new ways to assert dominance, to remind the prisoners of their powerlessness. On day 4, a rumor spreads that the released prisoner, 86U12, is planning to come back with friends to break everyone out. It's not true. Corpy never said any such thing, but Zimbardo believes it. He's so immersed in his role as prison superintendent that he spends hours planning how to defend against this imagined assault. The line between experiment and reality has dissolved. Not just for the participants, but for the researchers. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD and Zimbardo's girlfriend, visits on day 5. She walks into the basement and sees prisoners with bags over their heads being led to the bathroom in chains. She sees guards screaming at them. She sees young men who look broken, traumatized, empty. She's the first person to say, "This is wrong. You have to stop this." Zimbardo's response is defensive. He's collecting important data. The prisoners can leave whenever they want. They just have to say they want to quit. This is valuable research. Maslach pushes back. No. Look at what you're doing to these people. Look at what you've become. And Zimbardo, later, in interviews and his memoir, admits this. Of the 50 or so people who'd seen the experiment by that point, parents visiting, colleagues observing, graduate students helping, Christina Maslach was the only one who objected. Everyone else was either caught up in it or found it fascinating. He stopped the experiment on day 6, 8 days early, because one person who loved him and whom he trusted made him see what he'd become blind to. The Stanford prison experiment became famous. It's been written about in every introductory psychology textbook for decades. It's been turned into movies, documentaries, books. The lesson seemed clear: situations are more powerful than personalities. Put good people in a bad system, and the system wins. Ordinary people become cruel when given power and anonymity. Ordinary people become passive when stripped of agency and dignity. The Abu Ghraib prison abuses in Iraq decades later seemed like proof that Zimbardo was right. But in recent years, the experiment has come under intense scrutiny. Recordings emerged showing Zimbardo and his team coaching the guards to be tougher. You've got to make them feel like they're in prison. One researcher tells a guard who's being too lenient. Another recording catches Zimbardo telling guards to create feelings of fear and powerlessness. Some former participants have said they were essentially acting, playing roles they thought the researchers wanted. John Wayne, the cruelest guard, later said he'd based his character on a guard from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He knew what he was doing, knew it wasn't real, was performing cruelty rather than organically becoming cruel. The prisoners, meanwhile, later admitted they thought if they seemed too stable, the experiment would continue. So they played up their distress, gave the researchers what they seemed to want: breakdowns, compliance, transformation. Does this mean the experiment proved nothing? That it was all theater? Maybe. Or maybe it proved something even more interesting: that we're so good at role-playing that we convince ourselves that performing cruelty and actually being cruel might not be as different as we'd like to believe. But the experiment suggests something darker: that we're all capable of becoming what the situation demands. And the only way to know for sure is to be tested. Most of us will never be tested like that. And maybe that's the only thing that keeps us good: conformity and social pressure. Imagine you're sitting in a room with 7 other people. A researcher shows everyone 2 cards. On one card, a single vertical line. On the other card, 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. One of them is obviously the same length as the line on the first card. It's not subtle. It's not close. Line B is clearly, unmistakably the match. The researcher asks each person in turn, which line matches? The first person says, line A. Odd, but okay, maybe they misunderstood the question. The second person, line A. The third, line A. One by one, everyone in the room confidently chooses the wrong line. Now it's your turn. Your eyes tell you it's line B. You know it's line B. There's no question in your mind that it's line B. But 7 people just said line A. Do you trust your own perception? Or do you trust the group? Solomon Asch ran this experiment in 1951. The other participants were actors, all instructed to give the same wrong answer on certain trials. And here's what happened. 75% of real participants conformed at least once. They looked at a line they knew was wrong and said it was right, just because everyone else did. On average, people conformed on about 1/3 of the trials. Not every time, but enough to reveal something unsettling. We doubt ourselves more easily than we'd like to admit. After the experiment, Ash asked them why. Some genuinely started doubting their own vision. Maybe I misunderstood the instructions. Maybe my eyes are bad. Maybe there's something about the lighting I'm not accounting for. They engaged in what psychologists call normative influence, changing their private beliefs to match the group. Others knew they were right but couldn't bear the discomfort of disagreeing. I didn't want to look stupid. I didn't want everyone staring at me. I knew it was line B, but saying it out loud when everyone else said line A felt impossible. This is informational influence, publicly conforming while privately disagreeing. Both are troubling. Both suggest that truth, for most of us, is negotiable when it conflicts with social acceptance. Ash varied the experiment to see what factors affected conformity. When just one other person agreed with the real participant, conformity dropped dramatically. Having a single ally, one other person confirming your perception, made it vastly easier to resist the majority. When the actors' answers were less unanimous, conformity dropped. When even one actor broke ranks and gave the correct answer, the real participant felt freed to do the same. What this tells us, conformity isn't about being weak or stupid. It's about being human. We are social creatures who evolved to trust the group's judgment, to assume that if everyone sees something differently than we do, maybe we're the ones who are wrong. That instinct usually serves us well. Most of the time, the majority is right. Most of the time, deferring to collective wisdom is efficient. But not always. And the question Ash's experiment forces us to ask is, how much of what you believe is really yours? How many of your opinions, your perceptions, your certainties are just echoes of what everyone around you believes? When you think, everyone knows that, have you verified it? Or have you just conformed? It's easy to think you'd be in the 25% who never conformed in Ash's experiment. You'd trust your eyes. You'd speak your truth regardless of what others said. But the research suggests otherwise. Most of us conform far more than we realize. We don't even notice we're doing it. We laugh at jokes that aren't funny because everyone else is laughing. We nod along in meetings even when we disagree. We adopt the political views, the aesthetic preferences, the moral positions of the people around us, not through careful reasoning, but through the gradual, invisible pull of social pressure. Ash's experiment has been replicated dozens of times across cultures. In collectivist societies, conformity rates are even higher. In individualist societies, they're somewhat lower but still substantial. The effect persists. Even today, even in the age of think for yourself and question everything, we conform. We just don't call it that. We call it being part of a community, being a team player, respecting consensus, not being difficult. But it's still conformity. It's still abandoning our own judgment in favor of the groups. The Ash experiments revealed conformity in controlled, artificial settings. But what about real-world emergencies? What happens when conformity affects not just our perception of line lengths, but our willingness to help someone in danger? In 1968, John Darley and Bibb Latané began studying what they called the bystander effect. The inspiration was partly the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. The story that circulated at the time claimed that 38 witnesses watched her being stabbed to death over the course of 30 minutes, and none of them called the police. The reality was more complicated. The numbers were wrong. Some people did call, but the narrative stuck. People don't help when others are around. Darley and Latané wanted to understand why. They staged emergencies. In one study, participants sat in individual rooms, connected by intercom, discussing personal problems. One participant was actually an actor who, midway through, began having what sounded like a seizure. He choked, cried for help, said he was going to die. When participants thought they were the only one who could hear the seizure, 85% rushed to help within the first minute. But when they thought 4 other people could also hear, only 31% helped, and they took much longer to do so. The more bystanders present, the less likely any individual is to intervene. We diffuse responsibility. Someone else will handle it. Someone else is probably already calling for help. I don't want to overreact if no one else is reacting. In another study, researchers pumped smoke into a room where people were filling out questionnaires. When people were alone, 75% reported the smoke within 2 minutes. But when people were in a room with 2 actors who ignored the smoke, only 10% of real participants reported it. Even as the room filled with smoke, even as it became hard to see, people kept filling out their questionnaires, glancing at the smoke nervously, but not acting. Because no one else was acting. And if no one else seemed worried, maybe there was nothing to worry about. This is conformity at its most dangerous. Not conforming about line lengths or opinions, but conforming about reality itself. Is this an emergency? Should I be concerned? Should I help? We look to others for the answer. And if they're also looking to us, if everyone's waiting for someone else to define the situation, then no one acts. Kitty Genovese's story became symbolic of urban apathy, of people not caring. But that's not what the bystander effect is about. It's not that we don't care. It's that we're looking for social proof, for confirmation that action is necessary. When we see others not acting, we interpret the situation as not requiring action. And then we become one more person not acting, which reinforces everyone else's interpretation that action isn't needed. It's a feedback loop of inaction, driven by conformity. The research on the bystander effect required deception. Participants didn't know they were in a study. They thought the seizures were real, the smoke was real, the emergencies were real. They experienced genuine distress, guilt, confusion. Some participants who didn't help felt terrible afterward. They couldn't understand why they'd frozen, why they'd looked around instead of acting, why they'd deferred to others instead of trusting their own alarm. That's what makes these studies hard to repeat today. The psychological cost of making people confront their own inaction, their own conformity in situations where someone might need help, is significant. But the knowledge gained changed how we think about helping behavior. It's why emergency response training now teaches people to point at specific individuals and give them specific tasks. You, call 911. You, get the first aid kit. Breaking through diffusion of responsibility by assigning direct personal responsibility. It's why public service campaigns emphasize, if you see something, say something, instead of assuming someone else will. We learned that good people fail to help, not because they're bad, but because they're social. And in groups, social instincts can override moral ones. But conformity isn't just about perception or emergency response. Sometimes it's even more automatic, more mindless than that. There are these delightful studies, less famous but equally revealing, where researchers stage absurd situations to see if people will conform, even when there's no good reason to. In one, actors enter an elevator and all face the back wall instead of the door. Most people who enter afterward will also turn to face the back wall. No one tells them to. There's no logical reason. But the social pressure, the discomfort of being the only one facing a different direction, is enough. In another variation, the actors all remove their hats when a bell dings. After a few dings, the real participant starts removing their hat too, even though they have no idea why. We conform automatically, without thought, without intention. We mirror the group because mirroring is how we signal belonging, how we reduce social friction, how we avoid the discomfort of standing out. Most of the time, this is harmless. It's how we learn social norms, how we fit into new cultures, how we navigate unfamiliar situations. We watch what others do and we do the same. But it also means we're far less independent than we think. Our choices, our behaviors, our beliefs, they're all being constantly shaped by the people around us in ways we don't notice. Stanley Milgram, yes, the same one who ran the obedience experiments, also studied conformity in public spaces. He had actors suddenly stop on a busy New York sidewalk and stare up at a building. Within seconds, passers-by would stop and look up too, trying to see what everyone else was seeing. The more actors who stopped, the more real people joined them. Social proof in action. If that many people are looking at something, it must be worth looking at. Even when there was nothing to see. Even when it made no sense. We look where others look. We laugh when others laugh. We applaud when others applaud. We are, in a very real sense, performing our lives according to scripts written by the people around us. And we rarely notice we're doing it. The conformity research raises an uncomfortable question. How much of is really the group? Your political beliefs, did you arrive at them through careful reasoning? Or did you absorb them from your family, your friends, your online communities? Your aesthetic preferences, do you genuinely like that music, that art, that style? Or do you like it because the people you want to be like it? Your moral convictions, would you hold them if everyone around you believed differently? These aren't meant to be accusatory questions. They're invitations to self-examination. Because the research is clear, we are far more influenced by social pressure than we realize. ACH's participants didn't think of themselves as conformists. They thought they were just being reasonable, avoiding conflict, not making a fuss over something trivial. The bystanders who didn't help didn't think of themselves as apathetic. They thought they were reading the situation carefully, not overreacting, waiting for more information. The people who faced the back of the elevator didn't think of themselves as followers. They just felt uncomfortable being the only one doing something different. We don't experience conformity as conformity. We experience it as normal decision-making, as social awareness, as appropriate behavior. But from the outside, from the perspective of these experiments, it looks like something else, the gradual erosion of individual judgment in favor of collective agreement. And here's the thing, collective agreement is often correct. Groups are often wiser than individuals. Consensus is often a good heuristic for truth, but not always. And when the group is wrong, when consensus supports something harmful, when everyone's looking to everyone else for guidance and no one's actually thinking independently, then conformity becomes dangerous. The experiments we've explored can't be easily repeated today. Making people doubt their own perception, staging fake emergencies, manipulating social situations without consent. It all violates modern ethical standards, but we carry the knowledge forward. We know now that conformity is powerful, automatic, and usually invisible. We know that social pressure can override perception, judgment, even the impulse to help someone in danger. And knowing that, we can ask ourselves, when was the last time you disagreed with a group? When was the last time you said what you really thought instead of what felt safe? When was the last time you acted on your own judgment instead of waiting for social proof that action was appropriate? These are hard questions, because the honest answers might reveal how much we conform without realizing it. But awareness is the first step. Noticing when we're deferring to the group, when we're suppressing our own perception, when we're performing agreement instead of thinking independently. That's how we start to reclaim our autonomy. Not that we should never conform. Sometimes the group is right. Sometimes consensus is wisdom. But we should at least know when we're doing it. We should make it a choice instead of an automatic reflex. That's what these experiments gave us. Not just knowledge about human behavior in general, but a mirror showing us our own conformity, our own willingness to abandon truth for comfort. Whether we look into that mirror and change anything, well, that's up to us. Attachment, isolation, and belonging. Harry Harlow wanted to understand love, not romantic love, something more fundamental, the love between a mother and child. What is it made of? What does an infant actually need? In the 1950s, the prevailing theory among behaviorists was simple. Babies love their mothers because mothers provide food. Love is just reinforcement, conditioning. Pavlov's dog, but with milk instead of bells. Harlow didn't believe that, so he built 2 artificial mothers for baby rhesus monkeys. One was made of wire mesh, cold, hard, uncomfortable. But this wire mother had a bottle. She provided food. The other was wrapped in soft terry cloth, warm, gentle to hold. But she offered no food at all. If the behaviorists were right, the babies would cling to the wire mother. That's where the food was. That's where survival was. But that's not what happened. The baby monkeys would rush to the wire mother just long enough to feed, frantic, efficient, and then immediately return to the cloth mother. They'd spend 18 hours a day clinging to her soft body. They'd only leave her for minutes at a time. When Harlow introduced something frightening, a mechanical spider or a loud noise, the babies didn't run to the mother with food. They ran to the mother with comfort. They'd press against her cloth body until they felt safe enough to explore again. Harlow had proven something beautiful. Love is not just about survival. It's about comfort. Safety, touch, warmth, contact comfort, he called it. The physical sensation of being held, of touching something soft and warm, is a primary need. Not secondary to food. Primary, essential, fundamental. Baby monkeys, and by extension baby humans, need to be held. They need warmth. They need the physical sensation of safety that comes from touching another body. This changed everything. Parenting advice that had told mothers not to coddle their babies, to let them cry, to avoid spoiling them with too much affection, it all shifted. We learned that you can't spoil a baby with love. You can't hold them too much. Touch is a need, not a luxury. But then Harlow went further. He wanted to understand what happens when that need isn't met. What happens when there's no comfort at all? He built what he called the pit of despair. A stainless steel chamber, inverted pyramid shape, narrowing toward the bottom. Smooth walls that couldn't be climbed. Nothing to hold, nothing to touch. Just isolation. Complete, absolute isolation. He placed infant monkeys inside for weeks, sometimes months. When they emerged, they were broken. They rocked back and forth, endlessly, compulsively. They stared at nothing, unresponsive to other monkeys, to humans, to stimulation of any kind. They mutilated themselves, biting their own arms until they bled, pulling out their own hair, scratching their skin raw. They couldn't play, couldn't socialize. When placed with normal monkeys, they'd huddle in corners, unresponsive. The ones who survived to adulthood couldn't parent their own children. Female monkeys who'd been isolated would push their babies away, ignore them, or in some cases, harm them. They had no template for mothering, no understanding of what babies needed, because they'd never received it themselves. Some critical period had passed, some developmental window had closed, and what was broken stayed broken. Harlow's research team begged him to stop. Graduate students refused to work with him. His wife left him, disturbed by the cruelty of the work. But he continued, because he believed the knowledge was essential. We needed to understand attachment, to know what happens when children don't receive love, to prove that emotional needs are as important as physical ones. Later in life, Harlow struggled with depression and alcoholism. In interviews near the end of his life, he seemed haunted by what he'd done. He'd proven that love was essential, but he'd proven it by depriving infant primates of love and watching them break. Was it worth it? The knowledge changed the world. Attachment theory was born from these studies. Every parenting book, every adoption guideline, every understanding of childhood trauma and its lifelong effects, it all rests on what those monkeys suffered. We learned that isolation doesn't just hurt. It destroys something fundamental in the developing brain. That there are critical periods for forming attachments, and if those periods pass without connection, the damage may be permanent. We learned that institutions like orphanages, which provided food and shelter but little physical affection, were psychologically devastating. Laws changed. Policies changed. The way we care for children changed, all because Harlow's monkeys showed us what happens when we don't. But those monkeys paid the price. And Harlow paid a price too, a different one, but real nonetheless. Some questions can only be answered through suffering. And once we have the answers, we can never unknow them. Harlow's work was with monkeys, but the implications for humans were clear. And tragically, history provided its own experiment, one no one chose but everyone had to learn from. In 1989, when the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown, the world discovered his orphanages. Ceausescu had banned contraception and abortion, aiming to increase Romania's population. But poverty meant many families couldn't care for the children they were forced to have. Hundreds of thousands of children ended up in state institutions. What aid workers found was horrifying. Rows of silent cribs, dozens of infants in a single room, rocking back and forth. The same repetitive motion Harlow's isolated monkeys had shown. Children who didn't cry because they'd learned crying brought no response. Children who didn't reach out because no one had ever reached back. They were fed, kept clean after a fashion, but they weren't held, weren't spoken to, weren't played with. The staff-to-child ratio was impossibly high. The workers, overwhelmed and underpaid, could only provide minimal physical care. These children were experiencing what Harlow's monkeys had experienced: isolation in the presence of others. Physical presence without emotional connection. Food without comfort. Researchers who studied these children as they were adopted into families around the world found devastating effects. Many showed cognitive delays. Some never fully developed language. Many struggled with forming attachments, even to loving adoptive parents. The younger a child was when adopted, the better the outcomes. Children adopted before age 2 often recovered well. But children who spent their first several years in those orphanages often carried the effects for life. Brain scans showed differences. The brains of children raised in severe neglect were smaller, showed less activity in areas related to emotion and social bonding. Their stress response systems were dysregulated, amygdalas overactive, prefrontal cortices underdeveloped. They'd adapted to an environment where no one responded, where needs went unmet, where connection was impossible. And that adaptation, that survival strategy, became hardwired. This wasn't an experiment. No one chose this. It was a tragedy. But it taught us the same lesson Harlow's monkeys had: humans need connection. Not as a nice addition to food and shelter, as a fundamental requirement for normal development. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project, started in the early 2000s, has followed these children for decades now. Some have recovered remarkably. Others haven't. The variability teaches us that resilience is real but not universal, that some wounds heal and others don't. That timing matters immensely. There's a critical period for attachment, a window in early life when the brain is primed to form bonds. If that window closes without secure attachments forming, recovery is possible but not guaranteed. We learned this at tremendous human cost. The Romanian children didn't volunteer. They were victims of policy, of neglect, of systems that treated them as burdens instead of humans. But from their suffering, we gained knowledge. We know now, with certainty, that human connection is not optional. that institutions which provide care without love produce damaged children. That attachment is a biological need as fundamental as food. And we changed how we structure care for vulnerable children. Foster care systems prioritize attachment now. Orphanages in many countries have been closed or reformed. Adoptions happen earlier with more support. The knowledge came at a terrible price. But it came. And it's changed how we care for the most vulnerable. But isolation doesn't only harm infants. It damages adults too in different but still profound ways. In the 1950s, researchers at McGill University wanted to understand sensory deprivation. They paid college students to lie in a small room, vision restricted by translucent goggles, hearing muffled by foam padding and the hum of air conditioning, hands covered by cardboard tubes that prevented touch. Nothing to see, nothing to hear clearly, nothing to feel, just existence, stripped of stimulation. Students were paid well, $20 a day, which was significant money in the 1950s. Most thought it would be easy. Just lying around, getting paid, maybe catching up on sleep. Few lasted more than 2 or 3 days. They started hallucinating. Seeing patterns, shapes, entire scenes that weren't there. Hearing voices. Feeling sensations on their skin, insects crawling, hands touching them, even though they were alone. Their cognitive abilities declined. Simple math problems became difficult. They couldn't think clearly, couldn't concentrate, couldn't maintain trains of thought. When they emerged, they were suggestible, easily influenced. Willing to believe things they would have dismissed before. The researchers could change their attitudes on political or philosophical questions with simple persuasion. The brain, it turns out, needs input. It's not designed for silence. When deprived of external stimulation, it generates its own, creating hallucinations to fill the void. This research was funded partly by the Canadian government and partly by the CIA, interested in whether sensory deprivation could be used for interrogation or brainwashing. The answer was yes, but the effects were unpredictable and the psychological cost was high. Participants reported feeling anxious for weeks afterward. Some had nightmares. Some said the experience changed them, made them appreciate ordinary sensory experience. The sound of voices, the sight of colors, the feeling of textures. NASA funded similar studies, trying to understand what might happen to astronauts on long space missions. The findings were similar: humans need stimulation. Not constant, overwhelming stimulation, but some minimal level of sensory input, some connection to the world outside our own heads. Solitary confinement in prisons produces similar effects. Inmates kept in isolation for extended periods show increased rates of hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive decline, self-harm. The United Nations has called prolonged solitary confinement a form of torture. Yet it continues in many prison systems, often for months or years, sometimes for decades. The research on sensory deprivation showed us why. Not to justify it, but to understand it. Isolation breaks people, not metaphorically. Literally. The brain degrades under isolation, cognitive functions decline, psychological stability erodes. We are not built to be alone, not as infants and not as adults. Connection is not a luxury. Stimulation is not optional. We need each other, not just emotionally but neurologically. Our brains require input from the world, from other people, to function normally. Take that away, and we fall apart. These studies, Harlow's monkeys, the Romanian orphans, the sensory deprivation experiments, they all point to the same conclusion: human beings are fundamentally social creatures. We don't just benefit from connection. We require it for normal psychological development and functioning. This isn't weakness. It's design. Our brains are built to expect certain inputs: touch, sound, visual stimulation, social interaction. When those inputs are missing, development goes wrong, or in adults, functioning deteriorates. René Spitz, studying infants in foundling homes in the 1940s, documented what he called hospitalism, a failure to thrive that affected institutionalized babies. They had food, warmth, physical care, but they had minimal human contact, and they wasted away. Some died despite adequate nutrition. Others survived but showed profound developmental delays. John Bowlby's work on maternal deprivation in the 1950s and 60s documented similar effects. Children separated from their mothers during World War II, even when placed in safe, well-run institutions, showed lasting psychological effects. Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situation. Experiments in the 1970s revealed different attachment styles. Secure and insecure patterns formed in the first year of life that predict behavior decades later. All of this research, taken together, painted a picture: early relationships matter, not just for emotional well-being, for brain development, for cognitive functioning, for the ability to form relationships in adulthood. We need each other, and we need each other early, during critical developmental periods when the brain is rapidly forming, when neural pathways are being established, when templates for relationships are being set. The case of Jeannie, a girl discovered in 1970 after spending her first 13 years locked in a room, tied to a chair, with minimal human contact, showed the limits of recovery. Despite intensive intervention, she never fully developed language. She never formed secure attachments. Some critical windows had closed. She wasn't part of an experiment. She was a victim of abuse. But researchers worked with her, trying to help, trying to understand what was possible, what could be recovered. The answer was, some things, but not everything. Language has a critical period. So does attachment. The brain is plastic, adaptable, capable of remarkable recovery. But it's not infinitely plastic. Some damage, if it occurs early enough and lasts long enough, is permanent. This knowledge came from tragedy, from abuse, from natural experiments no one would ever deliberately create. But we gained it. And it changed how we understand human development. It changed how we structure childcare, how we think about adoption, how we design institutions, how we treat isolation in prisons, how we support families, how we intervene when children are at risk. The suffering of Harlow's monkeys, of Romanian orphans, of children like Jenny. It wasn't meaningless. It taught us. And we've used that knowledge to reduce suffering for others. But we can never forget the cost. We can never pretend that knowledge comes freely. Every insight we have about attachment and isolation was purchased with someone's pain. Sometimes animal pain, sometimes human pain. We carry that debt. And the least we can do is honor it by using the knowledge well, by ensuring that fewer children grow up without the connections they need, that fewer people suffer the isolation that breaks the mind. We are not built to be alone. And now we know why, and we know what happens when we are. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Conditional control and learned helplessness. It's 1920, Johns Hopkins University. A 9-month-old infant sits on a mat, playing with a white rat. He's a calm child, curious, reaching out to touch the rat's soft fur. His name is Albert. Though we'd later learn his real name was Douglas Merritt. John Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner are watching. They're behaviorists, convinced that all emotions are learned, that fear is just a conditioned response, that humans are blank slates shaped entirely by experience. They want to prove it. So they wait until Albert reaches for the rat again. And then Watson strikes a steel bar with a hammer right behind the child's head. A loud, terrifying noise. Albert startles, cries, pulls his hand back. They repeat this. Rat noise. Rat noise. 7 pairings over the course of a week. By the end, Albert sees the white rat and cries. He doesn't need the noise anymore. The rat itself triggers fear. Classical conditioning. Pavlov's dogs, but with a human infant and an emotion. But Watson and Rayner didn't stop there. They wanted to see if the fear would generalize. They showed Albert a rabbit. He cried. A dog. He cried. A fur coat. He cried. A Santa Claus mask with a white beard. He cried. The fear had spread to anything white and furry. Watson had successfully instilled a phobia in an infant. The plan was to then decondition Albert, to reverse the process, to prove that learned fears could be unlearned. But they never did. Albert's mother removed him from the study before the deconditioning could happen. And Watson and Rayner never followed up. They published their results. Little Albert became one of the most famous cases in psychology, cited in every textbook as proof that emotions can be conditioned. But what happened to Albert? For decades, no one knew. He disappeared from the historical record, a child used in an experiment and then forgotten. In 2009, researchers finally identified him, Douglas Merritt, who died at age 6, possibly from hydrocephalus, a neurological condition. Some researchers now believe he was already neurologically compromised during the experiment, which raises even more ethical questions. Was he deliberately chosen because his mother worked at the hospital and was vulnerable to pressure? Did Watson know the child had developmental issues? We don't know. Watson's personal papers were destroyed after his death. But we know this: a child was deliberately traumatized to prove a theoretical point. And that trauma was never addressed, never treated, never reversed. Watson went on to a successful career in advertising, using conditioning principles to sell products. He pioneered emotional appeals in marketing, the idea that you sell feelings, not just products. His work with little Albert taught him how to create associations, how to pair products with positive emotions, how to condition consumer behavior. He got rich. Albert got a phobia and possibly lasting psychological damage. The little Albert experiment couldn't be done today. Deliberately inducing fear in an infant, failing to decondition that fear, using a child who might have been neurologically vulnerable, it violates every modern ethical standard. But the knowledge remained. We learned that emotions can be conditioned, that fears can be created through association, that phobias might develop from pairing neutral stimuli with frightening experiences. That knowledge helped develop treatments. Exposure therapy, systematic desensitization, cognitive behavioral approaches to anxiety, they all build on the principles Watson demonstrated. But those principles were demonstrated on a 9-month-old child who never consented, never benefited, and possibly carried the effects for his short life. Watson's work was part of a broader movement in psychology, behaviorism. The idea that we could understand and control behavior through conditioning, that internal mental states didn't matter, only observable responses to stimuli. BF. Skinner took this further with operant conditioning, showing that behavior could be shaped through rewards and punishments. He trained pigeons to play ping pong, to guide missiles, to perform complex sequences of actions, all through carefully structured reinforcement. With animals, this was impressive but not particularly troubling. But when applied to humans, when behaviorism moved into therapy and institutional settings, things got darker. In the 1960s and 70s, aversion therapy became popular for treating alcoholism, smoking, and homosexuality. For alcoholism, patients would be given drinks while receiving electric shocks or drugs that induced severe nausea. The goal was to create a conditioned aversion, to make alcohol itself trigger disgust and fear. It worked, sometimes temporarily. But the relapse rates were high, and the treatment itself was brutal. Patients vomiting for hours, experiencing severe pain, all in the name of conditioning. For homosexuality, the approach was the same. Show men pictures of other men, administer electric shocks or nausea-inducing drugs, try to condition an aversion to same-sex attraction. This was considered medical treatment. Insurance covered it. Families pressured their gay children into it. People died by suicide during or after these treatments. The theory was straightforward. If homosexuality was a learned behavior, it could be unlearned through conditioning. Pair same-sex stimuli with pain, and eventually the attraction would disappear. It didn't work. Sexual orientation isn't a conditioned response. But that didn't stop the treatments from continuing for decades. The psychological damage was immense. Many people who underwent aversion therapy for homosexuality reported lasting trauma. Some developed PTSD. Some never recovered their sense of self. They'd been taught that a fundamental part of their identity was something to be feared, something deserving of pain. This continued into the 1980s and 90s in some places. Even today, conversion therapy persists in some communities, though it's been banned in many jurisdictions and condemned by every major psychological organization. The behaviorist premise that you can condition away unwanted behaviors and desires appealed because it was simple. It was mechanical. It promised control. But it ignored the complexity of human psychology, the difference between behaviors and identities, the reality that some things can't and shouldn't be changed. The harm done in the name of aversion therapy is incalculable. Lives destroyed, suicides, families torn apart, all because conditioning seemed like a solution to things that weren't actually problems. We learned from this. But we learned slowly, and people suffered while we learned. But perhaps the most influential conditioning research, the work that shaped our understanding of depression and helplessness, came from Martin Seligman's studies in the 1960s and 70s. Seligman was studying learning in dogs. He'd place them in a harness and deliver mild electric shocks. The dogs couldn't escape. They just had to endure. Later, he'd place the same dogs in a box with 2 compartments separated by a low barrier. Shocks would be delivered to one side, but the dogs could easily jump over the barrier to the safe side. Dogs that hadn't been harnessed learned this quickly. A few shocks, and they'd jump to safety. But dogs that had previously been shocked while harnessed didn't even try. They'd whimper, lie down, and accept the shocks. Even though escape was possible, even though they could see other dogs escaping, they'd learned helplessness. They'd learned, in that earlier experience, that nothing they did mattered. That pain was inevitable and uncontrollable. And that lesson stuck, even when circumstances changed. Seligman saw the parallels to human depression immediately. The passivity, the lack of motivation to change circumstances, the belief that nothing you do matters. He began studying learned helplessness in humans. Milder, of course. No electric shocks. Instead, unsolvable puzzles followed by solvable ones. Participants would work on puzzles rigged to be impossible. No matter what they did, they couldn't solve them. After multiple failures, they'd be given solvable puzzles. Control group participants, who hadn't experienced the unsolvable puzzles, would solve them easily. But participants who'd experienced failure first often didn't even try. They'd give up quickly, assume the puzzles were still impossible, display the same passivity Seligman's dogs had shown. This became the learned helplessness model of depression. The idea that depression isn't just sadness, but a learned belief that you have no control, that your actions don't matter, that failure is inevitable. The model has been influential, shaping cognitive therapy, informing treatments, helping us understand why depressed people often don't take actions that might help them. But the research itself was ethically fraught. Deliberately creating helplessness, even temporarily, even with solvable puzzles, causes distress. Some participants in these studies reported feeling worse about themselves afterward. Some showed depressive symptoms that persisted beyond the laboratory. Seligman and his colleagues defended the research, arguing that the knowledge gained, the understanding of helplessness and how to counter it, justified the temporary discomfort. And in fairness, the learned helplessness model has helped many people. Therapies based on it teach people to recognize when they're generalizing from past failures, when they're assuming helplessness that isn't actually present. But it was still created by making people, and before them animals, feel helpless. By demonstrating that we could break someone's will to try. The dogs in Seligman's experiments, some of them never recovered. They remained passive, fearful, unable to learn that circumstances had changed. The humans recovered more quickly. But some carried the effects longer than the researchers expected. This is the dilemma of psychology research. To understand suffering, sometimes we create it. To know how helplessness develops, we induce it. To develop treatments, we first demonstrate the problem. And the question that haunts this research is always the same. Was it worth it? For the individuals who suffered, probably not. For the broader population who benefited from the knowledge, possibly yes. But we can't ask those dogs. And the humans who participated often didn't know, until afterward, what they were really part of. The conditioning research also extended into more invasive territories. In the mid-20th century, behaviorist principles were applied to treat stuttering in children through punishment and shock therapy. Researchers would have children read aloud, and every time they stuttered, they'd receive a mild electric shock or a loud, startling noise. The theory was that the negative consequence would reduce the stuttering behavior. Sometimes it worked in the short term. The children would speak more carefully, more slowly, trying to avoid the punishment. But many developed worse speech problems. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others developed anxiety around communication that lasted into adulthood. The behaviorists saw speech as just another behavior to be shaped. They didn't account for the emotional complexity of stuttering, the anxiety that often underlies it, the way punishment increases that anxiety and makes the problem worse. Children were harmed in pursuit of a mechanical solution to a complex problem. There were also attempts to use conditioning to treat bedwetting, thumb sucking, nail biting. Devices that would wake children with alarms or mild shocks when these behaviors occurred. Some of these interventions helped. But some created new anxieties, new problems, shame and fear around normal childhood behaviors. The appeal of behaviorism was its simplicity. Behavior in, consequence, behavior changes. No need to understand complex inner experiences, motivations, emotions. But humans aren't that simple. And treating them as if they were caused harm that we're still accounting for. Perhaps the darkest application of conditioning came through the CIA's cruelty program in the 1950s through 70s. This wasn't academic research. This was government-funded experimentation in mind control and brainwashing. Researchers, including psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, subjected patients to intensive depatterning and psychic driving. This involved extended sensory deprivation, drug-induced comas lasting weeks, massive doses of electroshock therapy, far beyond therapeutic levels, repeated playing of recorded messages while patients were unconscious, complete isolation. The goal was to erase existing patterns of behavior and thought, reduce patients to a blank slate, and then recondition them with new patterns. These were real psychiatric patients, people seeking help for depression or anxiety. They didn't know they were part of experiments. They thought they were receiving treatment. Many never recovered. Some lost years of memory. Some developed permanent cognitive impairments. Families were destroyed. Lives were ruined. This wasn't academic curiosity. This was weaponized psychology, an attempt to create conditioning so powerful it could override identity itself. The program was eventually exposed and shut down. The CIA destroyed most of the records. Victims received settlements decades later, but no amount of money could restore what was taken from them. This represents the absolute extreme of behaviorism's dark side, The belief that humans are blank slates, that identity and memory and personality are just patterns to be erased and rewritten. That conditioning can achieve anything if applied intensely enough. It was wrong, scientifically and ethically, but it happened. And it happened because behaviorism, taken to its logical extreme, treats people as objects to be programmed rather than beings to be understood. The conditioning research taken together revealed both the power and the limits of behaviorism. We learned that fears can be conditioned, that behaviors can be shaped, that helplessness can be taught. But we also learned that not everything can be conditioned away. That sexual orientation isn't a behavior. That human psychology is more complex than stimulus and response. That treating people as machines to be programmed causes profound harm. We learned that creating suffering to study suffering has costs. That participants in psychological research are not just data points, but people who carry the effects of our experiments into their lives. The Little Albert experiment showed us that infants can be taught to fear. But it also showed us that researchers can cause harm without adequately considering consequences. The aversion therapy programs showed us that conditioning can change some behaviors. But they also showed us the danger of treating human complexity as a simple learning problem. The learned helplessness research showed us how depression develops. But it also showed us that creating helplessness, even temporarily, has ethical weight. Modern research ethics are built on these lessons. We have informed consent requirements now, debriefing protocols, protections for vulnerable populations, limits on the kind of distress researchers can cause. But those protections were written in response to harm already done. They're restrictions born from recognition of what went wrong. The conditioning research gave us powerful tools. Exposure therapy for phobias, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, understanding of how environments shape behavior. But those tools were forged through experiments that, today, we recognize as harmful. We can't undo that history. We can't unexpose little Albert to those loud noises. We can't give back the lost years to people traumatized by aversion therapy. We can't restore confidence to participants who learned helplessness in laboratories. We can only carry the knowledge forward, use it carefully, and remember that it came at a cost. Every time a therapist uses exposure therapy to help someone overcome a phobia, there's a line that traces back to Watson and a 9-month-old child crying at the sight of a white rat. Every time a cognitive therapy session helps someone recognize learned helplessness and challenge it, there's a line that traces back to Seligman's dogs, lying passively while shocks continued. These connections are uncomfortable. We'd rather believe that knowledge appears cleanly, without suffering attached to it. But it doesn't. Not in psychology. Not when studying humans and the things that hurt them. We learned by hurting, and then we used what we learned to help. Whether that trade was worth it, whether the ends justified the means, that's a question each person has to answer for themselves. But we can't pretend the trade didn't happen. We can't separate the knowledge from how it was gained, so we carry both, the insights and the guilt, the treatments and the trauma that revealed them. And we try, going forward, to learn with more care, more ethics, more consideration for the people who make our knowledge possible. Because in the end, they're not subjects. They're us. Memory, manipulation, and false realities. Can you remember being lost in a shopping mall as a child? The fear, the confusion, the moment you realized your parents weren't there. About a quarter of people, when asked this question as part of a study, would say yes. They'd describe it in detail. The layout of the mall, what they were wearing, who eventually found them. But here's the thing, they were never lost in a mall. Elizabeth Loftus proved this in the 1990s. She called it the Lost in the Mall study. Participants were given 4 stories from their childhood, provided by their families. 3 were real. 1, the story about being lost in a mall, was completely fabricated. About 25% of participants not only accepted the false memory, they elaborated on it. They added details their families never provided. They described emotions, sensations, specific moments, all from an event that never happened. Over multiple interview sessions, these false memories became more detailed, more confident, more real to the participants than some of their actual memories. Loftus wasn't being cruel. She was testing a hypothesis that had enormous implications, that memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. And reconstructions can include things that never happened. This research emerged during the recovered memory controversy of the 1980s and 90s. Thousands of adults in therapy were suddenly remembering childhood sexual abuse that they claimed they'd completely forgotten. Families were torn apart. People went to prison based on these recovered memories. But Loftus's research suggested that at least some of these memories might be false. Not lies. The people genuinely believed them. But false nonetheless, implanted through suggestive therapeutic techniques, through leading questions, through the brain's tendency to construct memories from fragments and imagination. This made her extremely unpopular in some circles. Survivors' advocates accused her of providing cover for abusers, of minimizing real trauma, of conducting research that would be used to discredit legitimate abuse allegations. And they weren't entirely wrong. Defense attorneys did use her research. Guilty people probably went free because juries learned that memory is unreliable. But innocent people also avoided prison. Families destroyed by false allegations were sometimes reunited. And therapeutic practices changed, becoming less suggestive, more careful about the difference between helping people remember and helping people construct. The cost of this research was high. Participants in Loftus's studies had to be debriefed, told that one of their childhood memories was false. Some found this disturbing. Some questioned all their memories afterward. If that memory was false, what else might be? But the knowledge was essential. We needed to understand that memory is fallible, that confidence doesn't equal accuracy, that sincerely held memories can be completely wrong. Loftus ran other studies too. In one, she convinced people they'd once met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, an impossible memory since Bugs Bunny is a Warner Bros. Character who would never appear at a Disney park. In another, she showed participants doctored photographs of themselves as children in a hot air balloon, an event that never happened. About half came to remember the balloon ride. The implications extended beyond therapy. Eyewitness testimony in criminal trials, historical accounts, personal identity itself, which is built on memories of who we've been. If memory is this malleable, this suggestible, this prone to incorporating false information, then what does that mean for our sense of self? We are, in large part, our memories. Our stories about where we've been and what we've experienced. If those stories can be rewritten, if details can be added that were never real, then who are we really? But memory manipulation isn't just about adding false events. It's also about changing real ones. Loftus's earlier work in the 1970s focused on how post-event information alters memory for events that actually happened. In one study, participants watched a video of a car accident. Afterward, some were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Just changing one word, to smashed, changed people's estimates of speed. The smashed group estimated higher speeds. A week later, all participants were asked if they'd seen broken glass in the video. There was no broken glass. But the smashed group was more likely to say yes, they remembered seeing it. A single word in a question had altered their memory of an event they'd witnessed directly. Other studies showed that describing a yield sign as a stop sign could make witnesses later remember a stop sign. Mentioning a barn in a question about a rural scene could make people remember a barn that wasn't there. Memory doesn't just fade over time. It transforms. It incorporates suggestions, expectations, information encountered after the event. And it does this seamlessly, without any conscious awareness that the memory has changed. This is terrifying for the legal system. Eyewitness testimony is often compelling to juries. When someone sits on the stand and says, "I saw him do it," with confidence, that's powerful. But Loftus's research shows that confidence and accuracy are barely correlated. The most confident witnesses are not necessarily the most accurate. And leading questions during investigation can contaminate memory, creating false certainty about things that didn't happen. The Innocence Project, which uses DNA evidence to exonerate wrongly convicted people, has found that mistaken eyewitness identification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions. People in prison for crimes they didn't commit, often because a witness sincerely, confidently, incorrectly remembered them as the perpetrator. Loftus's research explained why, and it led to reforms. Better procedures for lineups. Warnings to juries about the limitations of eyewitness testimony. More careful questioning of witnesses to avoid suggestion. But it couldn't undo the convictions that had already happened. It couldn't give back the years people had lost. And the research itself required deception. Participants didn't know their memories were being manipulated. They were shown videos and then fed misleading information, all without being told that the study was about memory distortion. After debriefing, some participants felt foolish. How could I have been so easily misled? Others felt disturbed. If my memory can be changed that easily, what else am I wrong about? Those feelings are the ethical cost of memory research. To prove that memory is unreliable, you have to make people unreliable. To show that false memories can be created, you have to create them. And once you've done that, participants carry the knowledge that their own minds can't be trusted. That their memories, their sense of the past, might be partly fiction. That's an uncomfortable way to go through life. Memory research extends beyond legal implications. It touches on identity, trauma, and the nature of reality itself. There's a phenomenon called choice blindness, demonstrated in studies by Lars Hall and Petter Johansson. Participants would be shown 2 photographs of faces and asked which they found more attractive. They'd point to one. The researcher would then hand them that photograph to look at more closely and explain their choice. Except, through sleight of hand, the researcher would sometimes hand them the photo they didn't choose. Most people didn't notice, and when asked to explain their choice, they'd generate reasons for preferring the face they'd actually rejected. I like her smile. His eyes are kind. Completely fabricating justifications for a choice they never made. In variations of this study, the effect held for moral and political judgments, for consumer preferences, for all sorts of decisions. We confabulate reasons for our choices, and we're not aware we're doing it. This suggests something unsettling. We don't have direct access to why we do what we do. We observe our own behavior and then generate explanations, stories that make sense of our actions. But those stories are reconstructions, not recordings. We narrate ourselves into being, and the narration isn't always accurate. Another line of research on cryptomnesia or unconscious plagiarism shows that we can forget where we learned something and come to believe we thought of it ourselves. A joke you heard becomes a joke you invented. An idea from a book becomes your original insight. You're not lying. You genuinely believe you came up with it. The boundary between self and other, between what we created and what we absorbed, is more porous than we'd like to think. All of this memory research points to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. You are not a reliable narrator of your own life. The stories you tell about your past, your memories of events, your understanding of why you made the choices you made, all of it is reconstruction. Some of it is accurate. Some of it is embellished. Some of it is completely false. And you can't tell which is which. You can't sort your real memories from your false ones by introspection. They feel the same. The false ones are sometimes even more vivid, more detailed, held with more confidence. This is what makes memory research so ethically complex. It robs people of certainty about their own past. It introduces doubt where there was none. It reveals that our sense of a continuous, coherent self is partly an illusion. And that knowledge, once gained, can't be ungained. Participants in memory studies leave with questions they didn't have before. Did that really happen the way I remember it? Am I sure? How can I be sure? Most adapt. Most continue with their lives, carrying the knowledge that memory is imperfect, but accepting it as part of being human. But some struggle. Some develop a kind of chronic doubt, questioning everything, unable to trust their own recollections. Is that harm? Is undermining someone's confidence in their own memory a form of damage? Researchers would argue no, that revealing truth isn't harm, that understanding the limitations of memory is ultimately protective, helping people make better decisions, avoid false certainty, appreciate the constructed nature of the past. But it still changes people. And changes forced on people through deception, even in the service of knowledge, have ethical weight. Perhaps the most famous study of false realities wasn't about memory at all, but about diagnosis and perception. In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan published On Being Sane in Insane Places, a study that shook psychiatry to its core. Rosenhan and 7 other mentally healthy people went to psychiatric hospitals and claimed to hear voices. Just once. They said they heard words like empty, hollow, thud. All 8 were admitted. 7 were diagnosed with schizophrenia, 1 with bipolar disorder. Once inside, they stopped reporting any symptoms. They acted completely normal. They told staff they felt fine. The voices had stopped. They wanted to go home. But the staff interpreted everything they did through the lens of their diagnosis. One pseudo-patient took notes, and this was recorded as writing behavior, a symptom of their disorder. Another paced the hallway out of boredom, which staff interpreted as nervous pacing. The pseudo-patients were kept for an average of 19 days. One was hospitalized for 52 days. They were given antipsychotic medications, which most pretended to take but actually hid and disposed of. When finally released, their diagnoses weren't, "You're healthy." They were discharged with schizophrenia in remission. Interestingly, actual patients often suspected the pseudo-patients weren't really ill. "You're not crazy. You're checking up on the hospital," one patient told Rosenhan. But the staff never noticed. Once labeled, the pseudo-patients couldn't shed their labels. Their sanity was invisible within the context of a psychiatric hospital. Rosenhan's study suggested that psychiatric diagnosis was more about context than about actual symptoms. That once someone was labeled mentally ill, everything they did was interpreted through that lens. This had huge implications. If professionals couldn't distinguish the sane from the insane in a clinical setting, what did that mean for diagnosis? For treatment? For involuntary commitment? Psychiatry responded defensively, and understandably so. Rosenhan had essentially infiltrated their institutions, lied to them, and then published findings suggesting they were incompetent. But the critique stuck. The study accelerated reforms in psychiatric practice, contributed to the closing of many large institutions, led to more rigorous diagnostic criteria. It also raised ethical questions about Rosenhan's methods. He'd deceived hospitals, occupied beds that real patients might have needed, received treatment he didn't need, all without the institution's knowledge or consent. And he'd put his pseudo-patients at risk. Psychiatric hospitals in the 1970s could be dangerous places. Some pseudo-patients witnessed abuse. One was afraid he'd be involuntarily committed long-term, that no one would believe he was faking. In a follow-up, Rosenhan told hospitals he'd be sending more pseudo-patients over the next 3 months. The hospitals flagged dozens of suspected fakes. Rosenhan never sent anyone. All the people flagged were genuine patients seeking real help. The study proved its point: diagnosis is unreliable. But it did so through deception, through using hospitals' resources under false pretenses, through creating situations where real patients were viewed with suspicion. Was it worth it? Did the reforms that followed justify the methods? Psychiatry says no. The study was flawed, dishonest, and unfair. Critics of psychiatric overreach say yes. The system needed exposing, needed reform, needed evidence that it was labeling and confining people inappropriately. 50 years later, the debate continues. Because the question isn't just about that one study. It's about whether deception in research can ever be justified. About whether the ends justify the means. About who gets to decide what counts as important enough to warrant lying, infiltrating, manipulating. These questions don't have clean answers, but they're important to ask. Because every false memory study, every choice blindness experiment, every infiltration of an institution, all of them rely on deception, on creating false realities and seeing how people respond. And once you've shown someone that their reality can be manipulated, that their memories can be altered, that their perceptions can be controlled, you've changed them, you've given them knowledge, but you've also taken something: confidence, certainty, the comfort of trusting their own mind. And that trade, like so many in psychology's history, is one we can't undo. Cognitive dissonance. It's December 20th, 1954. A small group of people are gathered in a suburban Chicago home, waiting for the end of the world. Their leader, Dorothy Martin, has received messages from aliens on a planet called Clarion. They've told her that before dawn on December 21st, a great flood will destroy the world. But the faithful, those who truly believe, will be rescued by flying saucers and taken to safety. The group has prepared. Some have quit their jobs. Some have left their spouses. They've given away possessions. They've said goodbye to family members who didn't believe. And they're not alone in that house. 3 people among them are not believers. They're psychologists: Leon Festinger, Henry Rieken, and Stanley Schachter. They've infiltrated the group to watch what happens when prophecy fails. Because Festinger has a theory. He calls it cognitive dissonance. The idea that when we hold contradictory beliefs, when reality conflicts with our commitments, we don't abandon our beliefs. We distort reality. Midnight passes. Then 1 a.m., dawn approaches. No flood. No flying saucers. Nothing. The group sits in devastated silence. Some are crying. Some are questioning. Dorothy Martin is in another room, desperately seeking new messages from the aliens. And then, at 4:45 a.m., Martin emerges with a new message. God has decided to spare the world because of the faith of this small group. Their belief was so strong, so pure, that it prevented the catastrophe. The relief is palpable. The dissonance resolves. They weren't wrong. They were so right that they saved the world. And here's what Festinger observed. Before the prophecy failed, the group was private, secretive, keeping their beliefs largely to themselves. After it failed, they became evangelists. They called newspapers. They sought converts. They proselytized. Their belief, instead of crumbling in the face of disconfirmation, intensified. This is cognitive dissonance at its most pure. When reality contradicts your beliefs, and you've invested too much to abandon those beliefs, you don't change your mind. You change your interpretation of reality. You tell yourself a story that makes everything coherent again. And often, that story involves doubling down, committing even harder, finding ways to prove to yourself and others that you were right all along. Festinger's study was brilliant psychology, but it was also ethically murky. He'd infiltrated a religious group under false pretenses. He'd observed their most vulnerable moments, their crisis of faith, their desperate attempts to maintain coherence, all without their knowledge or consent. He'd treated human suffering as data. When the book was published, When Prophecy Fails, it became a classic. It explained cult behavior, political extremism, why people cling to disproven theories. It gave us the concept of cognitive dissonance, which is now fundamental to psychology, marketing, politics, everything that involves changing minds. But the group felt betrayed. They'd opened their homes, shared their beliefs, included these strangers in their most intimate spiritual moments. And those strangers were researchers, taking notes, planning a book that would expose and analyze them. Some never recovered their trust in others. Some felt their spiritual crisis had been weaponized, turned into academic fodder. Was the knowledge worth that betrayal? Festinger's work taught us how people maintain beliefs in the face of contradictory evidence, how conspiracy theories persist, how political polarization intensifies, how anyone, not just cult members, engages in motivated reasoning to protect their worldview. We all experience cognitive dissonance every day. When we claim to value health but eat junk food. When we say we care about the environment but drive SUVs. When we believe we're good people but act selfishly. And we resolve that dissonance not by changing our behavior, but by changing our narrative. I'll eat better tomorrow. My individual actions don't matter. Everyone does this. Understanding this mechanism helps us recognize it. Maybe resist it. At least be honest about when we're engaging in self-deception. But we learned it by watching people's faith collapse and observing how they reconstructed it. By infiltrating their community and treating their crisis as an experiment. That's the cost. The knowledge came from violation of trust, from studying people at their most vulnerable without their permission, and we can't unknow it now. Cognitive dissonance theory is too useful, too explanatory, too embedded in how we understand human behavior. So we carry both the insight and the exploitation that produced it. But cognitive dissonance research didn't stop with Festinger's infiltration. He ran other, more controlled studies. In one, participants were asked to perform an incredibly boring task, turning pegs on a board over and over for an hour. Afterward, some were paid $20 to tell the next participant that the task was interesting and enjoyable. Others were paid only $1 for the same lie. Later, when asked privately how much they'd actually enjoyed the task, the one group reported liking it more than the $20 group. This seems backward. You'd think people paid more would be happier. But cognitive dissonance explains it. The $20 group had external justification for lying. They could tell themselves, I said it was fun because they paid me well. No dissonance. The $100 group had insufficient external justification. $1 wasn't enough to explain why they'd lied. So they resolved the dissonance internally. I must have actually found it somewhat interesting. Otherwise, why would I have said so? They changed their beliefs to match their behavior, to eliminate the discomfort of having acted in a way that contradicted their self-image as honest people. This is how we rationalize. This is how small ethical compromises grow into large ones. We do something slightly wrong, something we can't quite justify externally, and we adjust our beliefs to make it okay. It wasn't that bad. Everyone does it. They deserved it. We tell ourselves stories that eliminate dissonance, that maintain our sense of ourselves as good, rational, consistent people. The scary part is we don't notice we're doing it. The rationalization happens automatically, below conscious awareness. We genuinely come to believe the stories we tell ourselves. Festinger's boring task study revealed this mechanism. But it required deception. Participants didn't know the real purpose was to study dissonance. They thought it was about perception or performance. When debriefed, some felt manipulated. They'd been tricked into lying, then studied for how they justified it. That discomfort is the ethical cost. To study self-deception, you have to deceive. To understand rationalization, you have to create situations that require it. And participants leave knowing they were observed at their most self-deceptive, most rationalizing, most human. Cognitive dissonance theory helped explain another dark chapter in psychology's history, the Robbers Cave experiment. In 1954, Muzaffar Sherif brought 22 11-year-old boys to a summer camp in Oklahoma. They were all white, middle-class, well-adjusted kids, screened carefully to ensure they were psychologically healthy. The boys didn't know they were in an experiment. They thought it was just summer camp. Sherif divided them into 2 groups, housed separately, and for the first week let them bond. Each group developed its own identity, chose names, the Rattlers and the Eagles. They had their own flags, their own cheers, their own sense of group cohesion. Then Sherif introduced competition. Tug-of-war, baseball games, treasure hunts, with prizes for the winners. Within days, the groups began to hate each other. They raided each other's cabins, burned each other's flags, called each other names, refused to eat in the same room. In one incident, the Eagles refused to eat with the Rattlers, saying they'd been contaminated by being near them. Physical fights broke out. Boys who'd never been aggressive became hostile. The researchers had to intervene to prevent serious violence. Sherif had successfully created prejudice, hatred, and intergroup conflict in normal children in less than 2 weeks. Then came the final phase. Sherif wanted to see if he could reduce the conflict. He tried having the groups interact socially. It didn't work. They just fought more. So he created superordinate goals, problems that required both groups to work together. The camp's water supply was broken. The groups had to cooperate to fix it. A truck bringing food broke down and needed both groups to push it. Gradually, the hostility decreased. Boys started forming friendships across group lines. The rigid us versus them boundaries softened. By the end, you could barely tell the groups had been separate. Sherif's experiment is famous for showing how easily prejudice forms and how it can be reduced. It informed conflict resolution theories, peace-building practices, our understanding of racism and tribalism. But the boys never consented. They didn't know they were being manipulated, that the competitions were designed to create hatred, that the bonding they'd felt was being weaponized to make them cruel to other children. Some boys later said the experience changed them. They'd seen themselves become people they didn't recognize, bullies, haters. And it had happened so easily, so naturally, without any awareness that it was being engineered. They'd learned something about human nature, about how thin the veneer of civilization is, about how quickly we form in groups and demonize out groups. But they'd learned it by being made into a demonstration, by having their own capacity for cruelty revealed to them without warning. Is that knowledge worth that experience? For the boys, probably not. They didn't ask to learn how easily they could be made to hate. For society, possibly yes. We learned about the mechanisms of prejudice, about how conflict escalates, about how cooperation can reduce hatred. But we learned it by deliberately creating the conditions for children to hurt each other. And the boys who participated, they had to live with the memory of who they'd become at Robbers Cave, of the names they'd called, the raids they'd participated in, the hatred they'd felt toward other kids who were, objectively, just like them. That knowledge about themselves, they couldn't unknow it. And it came without consent, without warning, without preparation. That's what makes studies like this unrepeatable today. The psychological risk is too high. The potential for lasting harm is too real. But the knowledge remains. And we use it. Every conflict resolution program, every diversity training, every attempt to bridge divides between groups, it builds on what Sheriff discovered. We owe him. But we also owe those 22 boys who didn't know they were teaching us. There was another experiment that explored group dynamics and discrimination, though this one was conducted in a classroom rather than a camp. The day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, a third-grade teacher in Iowa named Jane Elliott wanted to teach her all-white students about discrimination. She divided the class by eye color. Blue-eyed children were told they were smarter, cleaner, better. They got extra recess, could go back for seconds at lunch, were praised and privileged. Brown-eyed children were told they were inferior. They had to wear collars to identify them. They were denied privileges, criticized, segregated. Within hours, the blue-eyed children became cruel. They mocked the brown-eyed students, refused to play with them, enforced the hierarchy with enthusiasm. The brown-eyed children became submissive, withdrawn. Their academic performance dropped. Their confidence disappeared. The next day, Elliott reversed it. Now brown-eyed children were superior. The same pattern emerged, just with different victims and perpetrators. By the end, the children had experienced both sides of discrimination. They'd felt the power of privilege and the pain of prejudice. They'd seen how quickly they became cruel when given permission, how quickly they internalized inferiority when it was imposed. It was a powerful lesson. Many of those students, interviewed decades later, said it changed them permanently, made them more aware of racism, more empathetic, more conscious of how systems of privilege operate. But it was also traumatic. Some students had nightmares. Some felt betrayed by their teacher. Some never forgot the feeling of being suddenly, arbitrarily, marked as inferior. Elliott's exercise became famous. It's been replicated in classrooms and workplaces around the world. Documentary films captured it. It's taught in diversity trainings. But it couldn't be done as research. There was no consent. The children were manipulated without warning. They experienced real distress, real humiliation, real cruelty from their peers. Today, most schools wouldn't allow it. The psychological risk is considered too high. Yet many argue the lesson is essential, that you can't truly understand discrimination without experiencing it. That temporary discomfort is justified if it creates lasting empathy. Others argue that children shouldn't be used as teaching tools, that simulating oppression trivializes real oppression, that the ends don't justify the means. Both sides have a point, and the tension remains unresolved. The cognitive dissonance research, Festinger's infiltration and lab studies, Sheriff's manufactured conflict, Elliott's classroom exercise, all of it reveals something uncomfortable about human psychology. We are not rational. We are rationalizing. We don't form beliefs based on evidence and then follow them wherever they lead. We form commitments, make choices, align with groups, and then we construct narratives that justify those commitments. We tell ourselves stories that make us the heroes, or at least the reasonable ones, in every situation. When reality contradicts our stories, we don't usually change the stories. We change how we interpret reality. This happens individually, in how we justify our choices and maintain our self-image. And it happens collectively, in how groups maintain cohesion, in how ideologies persist despite contradictory evidence, in how conflicts escalate as both sides construct narratives in which they're right and the other side is threatening. Understanding cognitive dissonance helps us recognize these patterns. Maybe resist them, at least sometimes. maybe be a little more honest with ourselves about when we're rationalizing rather than reasoning. But we learned this by deceiving people, by infiltrating communities, by manufacturing conflicts between children, by creating situations designed to provoke dissonance, and then studying how people resolved it. The knowledge is useful, essential even, but it came through means we now recognize as harmful. And that tension between the value of knowledge and the ethics of how it was gained, that's the thread running through all these experiments. We wanted to understand human nature, and we were willing to deceive, manipulate, and sometimes harm people to do it. The question isn't whether we learned anything. We did. The question is whether we can live with how we learned it, and whether future generations will look back at our current research practices and ask the same question: moral psychology and impossible choices. Imagine a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks. Ahead, 5 people are tied to the tracks, unable to move. You're standing next to a lever. If you pull it, the trolley will switch to a side track where only one person is tied down. Do you pull the lever? Most people say yes. Kill one to save 5. The utilitarian calculation is straightforward. Now imagine a different scenario. Same trolley. Same 5 people on the tracks. But this time you're on a bridge above the tracks, standing next to a very large person. If you push them off the bridge, their body will stop the trolley, saving the 5. But they'll die. Do you push? Most people say no. Even though the math is identical, 1 death versus 5, the action feels different. More personal. More like murder. This is the trolley problem, and variations of it have been used in thousands of psychology experiments over the past few decades. In fMRI scanners, researchers watch brain activity as people contemplate these dilemmas. When it's the lever, the decision is cognitive, rational. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lights up, the area associated with logical reasoning. When it's the push, emotional regions activate. The amygdala, involved in fear and moral disgust. The anterior cingulate cortex, associated with emotional conflict. Our brains process these identical mathematical problems completely differently depending on whether the harm is impersonal, pulling a lever, or personal, pushing someone. This reveals something fundamental about moral psychology. We're not consistent. We're not purely rational or purely emotional. We're operating on 2 systems simultaneously, an intuitive emotional system and a deliberative rational one, and they often contradict each other. The research using trolley problems has shown that. People become more utilitarian, more willing to sacrifice 1 for 5 when under time pressure. Psychopaths show less difference between personal and impersonal harm. They're fine with pushing. People are more willing to sacrifice men than women, strangers than family, elderly than children. Adding names and faces makes sacrifice harder, even when the numbers are the same. All of this helps us understand moral reasoning, how emotion and logic interact, why people reach different conclusions, even when presented with identical information. But here's the ethical complexity. These studies put people in impossible moral situations, force them to imagine killing, and then judge them based on their responses. Participants leave these studies having contemplated whether they'd push someone to their death, having calculated the value of different lives, having exposed their own moral intuitions, which sometimes aren't pretty. Some participants report feeling disturbed afterward. They don't like what they learned about themselves. They don't like that they hesitated, or that they didn't hesitate. They don't like knowing their brain distinguishes between lives based on age or gender or familiarity. Is that harm? Is making someone confront their own moral reasoning, showing them that they're less consistent or less principled than they thought, a form of psychological damage? Researchers argue no. This is just information. Understanding moral psychology is valuable, and no one's actually being harmed in these scenarios. But the scenarios feel real enough to activate genuine moral emotion. Real enough that people's responses in the lab sometimes predict their real-world moral decisions. So participants are, in a sense, being tested on their willingness to kill. And they know they're being tested. And they know researchers are judging their answers. That creates pressure, discomfort, sometimes lasting doubt about their own morality. The trolley problem studies are relatively benign compared to other moral psychology research. In 1973, John Darley and Daniel Batson ran the Good Samaritan study. Participants were seminary students, people studying to become religious leaders, literally training to be morally exemplary. They were asked to prepare a short talk. Half were assigned to talk about career opportunities for seminary students. Half were assigned to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the biblical story about stopping to help someone in need. Each student was then told to walk to another building to deliver their talk. Some were told they were running late. They needed to hurry. Some were told they had plenty of time. On the path between buildings, the researchers had planted a Confederate slumped in a doorway, head down, eyes closed, coughing and groaning. Would the seminary students stop to help? It depended almost entirely on whether they were in a hurry. Of those who had plenty of time, 63% stopped to help. Of those who were late, only 10% stopped. And here's the kicker: whether they'd just been preparing a talk about the Good Samaritan made no difference. Students literally on their way to give a lecture about helping people in need stepped over someone who appeared to be suffering. The situation, being in a hurry, overwhelmed their moral convictions. Darley and Batson proved that moral behavior is less about character and more about circumstances. That even people dedicated to helping, even people actively thinking about moral obligations, will fail to help if they're rushed. This has practical implications. It changed how we think about bystander intervention, about designing environments that make helping easier, about not assuming that people who don't help are bad people. But it also required deceiving seminary students, creating a fake emergency, and then documenting their failure to help. Imagine being one of those students. You stepped over someone who seemed to need help. You didn't stop. You didn't check if they were okay. You were more concerned about being late for your talk. And then, in debriefing, you learn it was staged. You learn you were being tested. You learn you failed. How do you feel about yourself after that? Some students were fine, understanding it as a learning experience. But others reported feeling terrible. They'd seen themselves act in a way that contradicted their values, their training, their self-image as compassionate people. The study revealed their own capacity for moral failure, and that's a heavy thing to carry. But perhaps the most disturbing research in moral psychology doesn't involve hypotheticals or staged situations. It involves asking people to justify their moral intuitions when they can't. Jonathan Haidt pioneered research on moral dumbfounding, the phenomenon where people know something is wrong but can't explain why. He'd present scenarios like a brother and sister on vacation together have sex once. They use protection. It doesn't harm their relationship. They never do it again. Is it wrong? A family's dog is hit by a car and killed. They decide to eat it. Is it wrong? Someone buys a chicken at the store, has sex with it, then cooks and eats it. Is it wrong? Most people's immediate reaction is disgust. Yes, that's wrong, obviously. But when pressed to explain why, they struggle. The incest scenario has no victim, no harm, no lasting consequences. The dog was already dead. The chicken was going to be eaten anyway. People grasp for reasons. It's unnatural. It's disrespectful. What if someone finds out? But these don't really hold up to scrutiny. Eventually, Many people just say, "I don't know why, but I know it's wrong." This is moral dumbfounding. The moral intuition fires automatically, emotionally, but the reasoning that's supposed to justify it comes up empty. Haidt's research suggested that our moral judgments are largely intuitive, emotional, automatic, and reasoning comes after, as a post hoc rationalization for what we already feel. We're not reasoning our way to moral conclusions. We're feeling our way there, and then using reason to justify what we've already decided. This has huge implications for moral philosophy, for how we argue about ethics, for whether rational debate can ever change anyone's mind about deeply held moral beliefs. But the research required putting people in scenarios designed to make them uncomfortable, asking them to think about incest, bestiality, cannibalism, watching them struggle to justify their disgust. Some participants found these scenarios disturbing. They didn't want to imagine these situations, didn't want to examine their own moral intuitions so closely, didn't like learning that their moral reasoning was largely rationalization. In debriefing, Haidt would explain that the scenarios were designed to be harmless, to isolate moral intuition from harm. But some people left feeling contaminated, disturbed by what they'd been asked to think about. Is that harm? Is making people contemplate taboo scenarios a form of violation? The knowledge gained helps us understand moral psychology, how intuition and reason interact, why people disagree so fundamentally about ethics. But it came through making people uncomfortable, through presenting them with scenarios specifically designed to provoke disgust, and then studying that disgust. The line between valuable research and gratuitous disturbance isn't always clear. There's another study that deserves mention, though it straddles the line between moral psychology and social influence. In various forms throughout the 1960s and 70s, researchers tested moral behavior through what they called lost letter techniques. They'd drop envelopes on the ground in public places, addressed and stamped but not mailed. Some letters were addressed to neutral organizations, others to controversial ones, the Communist Party, the Nazi Party, civil rights groups. The question, would people mail them? And would their willingness depend on the organization? Results showed that people were far more likely to mail letters to organizations they agreed with or found neutral. Letters to groups they opposed were often torn up or ignored. This revealed something about moral behavior. We don't always do what's right. We do what aligns with our values. Mailing someone's letter seems like a basic ethical act, but it's contingent on whether we approve of the recipient. Similar studies left wallets with identification in public places, some with photos of people of different races. Return rates varied significantly based on the perceived race of the owner. These studies didn't require deception of participants, but they did involve staging situations that revealed people's moral failures, their prejudices, their conditional ethics. And they often involved using real organizations, names without permission, potentially causing reputational harm. The knowledge gained, that moral behavior is contingent and biased, helped us understand how prejudice operates, even in people who consider themselves ethical. But it came through creating situations designed to make people fail moral tests they didn't know they were taking. All of this moral psychology research, the trolley problems, the Good Samaritan study, the moral dumbfounding scenarios, the lost letter technique, they reveal the same basic truth. We are not the rational moral agents we believe we are. Our moral judgments are heavily influenced by emotion, by circumstance, by factors we're not aware of and wouldn't endorse if we were. We think we act based on principle, but often we act based on intuition, and then we construct principles to justify what we've already done. We think we'd be the one who stops to help, who makes the hard moral choice, who resists situational pressures, but research suggests most of us wouldn't. This knowledge is humbling. It's useful for designing better systems, for understanding moral disagreement, for being honest about our own limitations. But it's also uncomfortable. We don't like learning that we're less consistent, less principled, less morally reliable than we thought. And the research revealed these truths by putting people in situations that exposed their moral failures, their inconsistencies, their disgust reactions that they couldn't justify. That's the cost. Knowledge about morality gained through manipulation of moral situations. We can't repeat many of these studies today with the same methods. Ethics boards are more protective now. Participants have more rights. Deception is harder to justify. But the knowledge persists. We know now how circumstantial moral behavior is, how emotional moral judgment is, how inconsistent moral reasoning is, and we use that knowledge. In policy design, in understanding ethical disagreements, in being more compassionate toward people who fail morally, recognizing that we'd likely fail in the same circumstances. The question is whether the participants who were tested, who were exposed, who were made to confront their own moral limitations, whether they benefited from that exposure or were harmed by it. Some say they grew from it, became more self-aware, more humble, more thoughtful about their own moral reasoning. Others say they were damaged by it, left with doubt, with shame, with uncomfortable knowledge about themselves they didn't ask for. Both can be true. Knowledge always has a cost, and in psychology, that cost is often paid by the people who help us learn. Deception and the Nature of Reality. It's 1939. University of Iowa. 22 orphan children have been selected for a speech study. They're divided into two groups. Half receive positive speech therapy, praise and encouragement for their speaking abilities. The other half receive negative therapy, told that they're beginning to stutter, that their speech patterns show concerning signs, that they need to be very careful, or their problems will worsen. Most of the children in the negative group didn't stutter before the study. They were normal speakers. But after weeks of being told they had problems, of being constantly monitored and criticized, some of them developed speech difficulties, hesitations, blocks, patterns that looked like stuttering. The study was run by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor. Johnson himself was a stutterer, desperate to understand how the condition developed. He believed stuttering was learned, created by parental anxiety and criticism. He wanted to prove it. So he created stuttering in children who didn't have it. The experiment was kept hidden for decades. When it finally came to light in 2001, it became known as the Monster Study, a name reportedly used by some of Johnson's colleagues at the time, reflecting their horror at what he'd done. Some of the children who received negative therapy carried speech problems for life. Others developed psychological issues, anxiety around speaking, low self-esteem. They'd been deliberately damaged to test a hypothesis. In 2007, the University of Iowa issued a formal apology. Several of the surviving participants received financial settlements, but no amount of money could restore what was taken from them. Johnson's career continued successfully. He became a prominent researcher in speech pathology. He published widely, trained generations of therapists. His theory about stuttering being learned was eventually disproven, ironically. Most stuttering has neurological and genetic components that criticism can't create. So the harm was done for knowledge that turned out to be wrong. The children suffered for a theory that collapsed. They carried lifelong effects from an experiment that didn't even prove what it set out to prove. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of research ethics, not just the harm done, but the harm done for knowledge that proves false, incomplete, or misleading. At least when experiments yield valid insights, there's an argument that the suffering served a purpose. But what about when it doesn't? What about when we hurt people to test hypotheses that turn out to be wrong? The monster study represents one form of deception in research, lying to participants about what's happening to them. But there's another form, perhaps more common, that involves researchers lying about who they are. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, sociologist Lard Humphreys conducted research on anonymous homosexual encounters in public restrooms, what were colloquially called tea rooms. Homosexuality was illegal in most of the United States at the time. These encounters were clandestine, risky, conducted by men who were often married, often living closeted lives. Humphreys wanted to understand who these men were, to challenge stereotypes about gay men. So he positioned himself as a lookout in these restrooms, a watch queen, who'd warn participants if police or others approached. This gave him access to observe encounters without participating. But he went further. He'd record license plate numbers, then use his connections with police to get names and addresses. A year later, he'd show up at their homes pretending to be conducting a health survey, asking questions about their marriages, jobs, lives. The men never knew they'd been observed, never knew their illegal activities had been documented, never knew this interviewer was the same person who'd been present during their most vulnerable, most risky moments. Humphreys published his findings in Tea Room Trade, arguing that these men were ordinary, that many were married and living conventional lives, that the stereotype of gay men as deviant outsiders was false. The book helped humanize gay men at a time of intense persecution. It provided evidence that homosexuality was more common and more normal than the public believed. But the ethical violations were severe. Humphreys had invaded privacy, deceived participants, put them at risk. If his data had been subpoenaed, those men could have been arrested, divorced, fired, imprisoned. The sociology community erupted in debate. Some defended Humphreys, arguing that research on hidden populations required deception, that the knowledge gained helped fight oppression. Others condemned him, arguing that vulnerable populations deserve more protection, not less, that the ends don't justify the means, that research built on deception and violation of consent is inherently unethical. Humphreys himself seemed conflicted. In later years, he acknowledged the ethical problems with his methods. He became an advocate for gay rights, using his academic position to fight discrimination. But the men he studied never consented. They never knew they'd become data. Their private lives were exposed to academic scrutiny without their knowledge or permission. For them, the research wasn't liberation. It was violation. Similar patterns of covert observation appeared throughout psychology and sociology in this era. Researchers would infiltrate religious communities, political movements, support groups, always as participant observers, always claiming to be genuine members while secretly taking notes. The justification was always the same. These groups won't allow open research, and understanding them is important, so deception is necessary. Sometimes the research revealed harmful practices, cults that exploited members, organizations that radicalized people, groups that caused psychological damage. In those cases, the deception seemed justified in retrospect. But other times, researchers simply exposed private communities to public analysis, taking intimate moments and turning them into academic papers. The people observed felt betrayed when they learned the truth. We trusted you. We shared our lives with you. And you were studying us like specimens. That betrayal changed many of these communities, made them more guarded, more suspicious, less open to outsiders. The research didn't just extract knowledge. It damaged trust. And once that trust is broken, it's hard to rebuild. Communities that were infiltrated once became permanently suspicious. Researchers who came later, even with good intentions and proper ethics, faced barriers created by past violations. The sins of earlier researchers became burdens for later ones. There's a particular category of deception research that deserves attention: studies where participants are led to believe they've harmed someone. In various experiments from the 1960s through the 80s, researchers would create situations where participants thought they'd caused someone pain, distress, or injury. In one common design, participants would be told they're testing an exercise machine. The other participant, say actually an actor, would use the machine, and it would appear to malfunction, seemingly injuring them. The real participant would witness this, believing they'd caused harm by incorrectly operating the controls. Researchers wanted to study guilt, helping behavior after causing harm, the psychology of responsibility. After observing the participants' responses, guilt, attempts to help, denial, researchers would debrief them, explaining that no one was actually hurt. But the relief of learning no harm was done didn't erase the experience of believing you'd hurt someone. That guilt, that panic, that sick feeling in your stomach, participants carried those for the duration of the study. Some participants reported that the experience stayed with them. Even knowing it was fake, they remembered how it felt to believe they'd caused injury. Some said it made them more anxious in situations where they might cause harm. Others said it gave them nightmares. The researchers documented how people respond to causing harm. But they did it by making people feel like they'd caused harm. Is temporary but intense psychological distress justified if it yields knowledge about guilt and responsibility? The participants whose feelings were manipulated would probably say no. The psychologists who used that knowledge to develop interventions for people struggling with inappropriate guilt might say yes. Both perspectives have merit, and the tension between them remains unresolved. Perhaps the most systematic use of deception in research came from Stanley Milgram. Yes, him again, in his obedience experiments. But he also ran other studies that relied heavily on staged scenarios. In one, he had actors go into busy subway cars and ask for seats without giving a reason. "Excuse me, may I have your seat?" Most people gave up their seats, even though the requester was young and healthy, even though there was no obvious need. Milgram was studying compliance with direct requests, seeing how often people would do something unreasonable simply because someone asked. In another variation, the actors would ask in different ways, politely, aggressively, while looking unwell. Response rates varied based on presentation. This research taught us about social norms, about how we respond to requests, about the power of direct asking even when there's no good reason to comply. But it turned ordinary people going about their day into unwitting research subjects. They were studied without consent, manipulated without knowledge, analyzed without permission. The invasion was minor, relatively harmless. But it was still an invasion, and it set a precedent. If researchers can study people in public spaces without consent, where's the line? Can they manipulate situations? Stage scenarios. Create false realities to see how people respond. Over time, that line became blurry. Researchers pushed boundaries, testing what they could get away with, what ethics boards would approve, what participants would tolerate once they learned the truth. Some of that pushing led to valuable knowledge. Some of it just led to people feeling violated. The most philosophically troubling form of deception research involves studies where participants are made to question reality itself. We've discussed the false memory research, where people come to remember events that never happened. But there are other studies that manipulate perception and cognition in ways that destabilize people's sense of what's real. In some experiments, researchers would alter participants' sense of time, put them in rooms with clocks that ran fast or slow, creating disorientation about how much time had passed. In others, They'd create subtle hallucinations through suggestion and environmental manipulation, making people doubt what they were seeing or hearing. The goal was often to understand perception, cognition, the boundaries between reality and illusion. But the method involved destabilizing people's grip on reality. Most participants recovered quickly once debriefed, but some reported lingering doubts. If I could be made to see things that weren't there, how do I know what's real now? That question, that seed of doubt, was planted by researchers. And once planted, it's hard to remove. There's also research on gaslighting techniques, studying how people respond when their perceptions are systematically contradicted. Researchers would create situations where participants saw or heard something, then have confederates deny it happened, creating doubt about the participants' own memory and perception. This helped us understand psychological abuse, how gaslighting works, how it damages victims' confidence in their own minds. But it required actually gaslighting people, temporarily, in controlled conditions. With debriefing afterward, is that justified? Can we study abuse by committing abuse, even in mild forms? The knowledge gained helps therapists recognize and treat gaslighting victims. It helps legal systems understand psychological manipulation. It helps people identify when they're being gaslit. But it was gained by making people doubt their own perception, by destabilizing their sense of reality, by creating experiences that, even though explained later, left marks. All of this deception research, from the monster study to Humphrey's tea room, observations to the staged harm, experiments to the reality manipulation studies, they share a common thread, treating people as means to ends. The participants became tools for generating knowledge. Their experiences, their distress, their confusion, their trust, all of it was instrumental, valuable only for what it could teach researchers. This is the core ethical problem with deception in research. It denies participants autonomy. They can't give informed consent if they don't know what's really happening. They can't choose whether to participate if they don't know they're in a study. The counter-argument is pragmatic. Some things can only be studied through deception. If participants know what's being tested, their behavior changes. The knowledge we gain through deception is knowledge we couldn't get any other way. And some of that knowledge is genuinely important. It helps us understand human nature, develop therapies, design better systems, protect vulnerable people. But the cost is borne by specific individuals who didn't choose to pay it. People who trusted researchers, who participated in good faith, who were deceived or manipulated or harmed in service of abstract knowledge. Those people didn't volunteer for that. They were conscripted, and that's what makes this category of research so ethically fraught. It's not just that harm was done. It's that harm was done to people who didn't agree to accept that harm. Modern ethics review boards are much more skeptical of deception now. They require that deception be minimized, that debriefing be thorough, that participants be allowed to withdraw their data after learning the truth. But many of the studies we've discussed couldn't be done at all today, not even with better safeguards. The deception is too extensive, the potential harm too great, the violation of autonomy too fundamental. So we carry forward the knowledge those studies generated. We use it. We build on it. We cite it in papers and teach it in classes. But we also carry forward the knowledge of how it was obtained. The deception, the violations, the people who were used without full consent. Both pieces of knowledge matter, and both shape how we think about what research should be. These 50 experiments, and the dozens more we mentioned along the way, they form a map of human nature. Not a complete map. There are territories unexplored, questions unasked, aspects of ourselves these studies never touched. But the map they created shows us some fundamental truths. that we're more obedient than we believe, more conformist than we'd like, more circumstantially moral than we claim. That we need connection not as a luxury, but as a biological necessity. That our memories are reconstructions, our reasoning is rationalization, our sense of self is partly narrative fiction. That we can become cruel when given permission and authority. That we can ignore suffering if everyone else is ignoring it. That we can hate people who are just like us if they're placed in an opposing group. These are uncomfortable truths. We'd rather believe we're independent, rational, consistently moral. That we'd be the one who resists authority, who helps in emergencies, who stands against prejudice. But the research suggests most of us wouldn't. Most of us are shaped by situations more than we shape them. Most of us conform, obey, rationalize, fail. That's not a reason for despair. It's a reason for humility. If we know we're prone to obedience, we can question authority more carefully. If we know we're prone to conformity, we can check whether our beliefs are really ours. If we know moral behavior is circumstantial, we can design situations that make ethical action easier. Knowledge about our weaknesses can become armor against them. Not perfect armor. We'll still fail. But at least we'll fail with awareness, with the possibility of course correction, with the humility to recognize our failures for what they are. The experiments gave us that knowledge. They gave it at tremendous cost, through methods we now recognize as harmful, by people who didn't fully consent to paying that cost. We can't undo that. We can't give back what was taken from the participants, from the animals, from the communities that were studied and violated. But we can honor the cost by using the knowledge well, by teaching it with honesty about its origins, by ensuring we don't repeat the ethical failures that produced it, by remembering that every insight into human nature came from humans who felt, who suffered, who trusted, and who were sometimes betrayed by that trust. They were more than research subjects. They were people. And while we've gained knowledge from their experiences, we've also incurred a debt. The debt of using that knowledge ethically, of protecting future generations from similar violations, of maintaining the hard-won reforms that came from recognizing past harms, of remembering. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might find these ideas uncomfortable. These revelations about obedience and conformity, about the malleability of memory and the circumstantial nature of morality, they're not peaceful thoughts, but discomfort can be wisdom. Knowing what we're capable of, both good and terrible, is the foundation for choosing more carefully who we want to be. You're not doomed to obey, to conform, to fail morally. You're just prone to it, like all of us. And knowing that, being honest about that, is how you start to resist it. The experiments showed us our nature. What we do with that knowledge is our choice. Choose awareness over certainty. Choose questioning over automatic obedience. Choose genuine connection over the comfort of isolation. Choose, when you can, to be the person who stops to help, who speaks up when the group is wrong, who resists authority that demands cruelty, who remembers that other people are not means to your ends, but ends in themselves. You won't always succeed. None of us do. But trying, failing, learning, trying again, that's what these experiments ultimately teach us is possible. We are not simply our worst tendencies. We are also our capacity to recognize and resist them. And that capacity, however fragile, however hard-won, is reason for something that might not quite be hope, but is close enough. Reason to keep trying. Reason to keep questioning. Reason to remember where we've been so we can choose more carefully where we're going. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring these difficult territories of psychology's past, for sitting with uncomfortable truths, for thinking about the cost of knowledge and the weight of how we use it. If this resonated with you, If you found value in these calm explorations of uncomfortable history, consider sharing it with others who think deeply about these questions. Consider subscribing if you want more journeys like this. Consider leaving a comment about which experiment affected you most. But most importantly, consider what you'll do with this knowledge. How it will shape how you think about yourself, about others, about the choices you make when no one's watching and when everyone is. Because in the end, these weren't just experiments about human nature in general. They were experiments that revealed your nature too. You're capable of obedience and resistance, of conformity and independence, of cruelty and compassion, of failing and learning. What you choose to cultivate, what you choose to resist, that's up to you. Sleep well, dream honestly, and remember, knowing what we're capable of is the first step in choosing who we want to be. Good night.